Tonight, the toxic and macho culture at the heart of number 10 during the COVID crisis and claims it made government policy worse. Helen McNamara, the second most senior civil servant in Boris Johnson's government during the pandemic, tells the COVID inquiry the government missed a female perspective and that women were ignored and excluded. And breaking news tonight as evacuations from southern Gaza into Egypt start. The Foreign Office confirms that the first British nationals have crossed the border. And as Rishi Sunak prepares for a cosy interview with tech boss Elon Musk, we'll look back at when politics meets big tech. All that and more with former Treasury advisor Poppy Trowbridge and Labour's former Director of Policy Andrew Fisher, who'll be with me for the next hour. It's Wednesday, I'm Beth Rigby, live from Westminster, and this is the Politics Hub. All of that still to come, but first, some developing news on the conflict in the Middle East, which has today seen the first evacuations from southern Gaza to Egypt, almost a month into the war. But there's still some confusion about the situation of British nationals. The Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, said today that teams are standing by to help people flee Gaza. And in the past hour, the Foreign Office have said that the first British nationals have now crossed the border. Well, our deputy political editor, Sam Coates, has hot-footed it in here. Sam, what is the latest tonight from the government?
So just after 6:30 this evening, we got word that the first British nationals had left Gaza through the Rafah crossing. Now, it's a really important moment because this is the culmination of weeks of very careful, painstaking diplomacy. Beth, you'll remember last weekend, Britain at the UN abstained on a vote over a ceasefire rather than voting with America and Israel, which you might think it would have done given its public positions, precisely so that it didn't antagonise Egypt, so that it could have this discussion. And I understand diplomats will be working hard in Cairo and around the region in order to facilitate this. Now, it's a big operation for Britain to do this. We don't have very many facts. We don't know who has come out. We don't know what numbers have come out. But what we do know is that each individual who comes out has to be previously agreed by Britain with both Israel and Egypt. So you have to be on a list, and there are UK Border Force officials at that Rafah crossing ticking people off. You can have a British passport and you'll be turned away if you're not on that list. But now, for the first time, people have started coming through. OK, thank you, Sam. Thanks for that update. Now, you're going to be back a bit later with us with some exclusive polling that you've got, so I'm looking forward to that. But I want to talk now about what we found out at the COVID inquiry today, because it was another set of damning revelations. And I have to say, revelations that have hit a nerve with me, and I've no doubt countless other women, not just here in Westminster, but around the country, all too used to dealing with sexism in their working lives. Because today we learnt that it isn't just us who feel it. The most senior female official in government felt it too. Former Deputy Cabinet Secretary Helen McNamara told the inquiry about the macho culture contaminated by ego. Women who worked in government reported they'd become invisible overnight, while violent and misogynistic language went unchecked by the PM. And this mattered, not just because the heart of government shouldn't be a frat house, but because it skewed policy. Helen McNamara said more consideration was put into hunting and shooting policy when it came to the pandemic response than the welfare of children, pregnant women and domestic abuse victims. She told the inquiry it is very difficult to draw any conclusion other than women have died as a result. And if you feel angry about what you heard today, I'm not surprised. I am too. And one of the lessons we must surely take from this is that an old boys' club is the worst way to run a country. Good government doesn't just need competence, but female and diverse perspectives among senior decision makers. Well, we'll be discussing that a bit later tonight, but first, here's our political correspondent, Tamara Cohen.
Boris Johnson at the start of March 2020.
We do have a great plan, a plan to tackle the spread of coronavirus.
Full of confidence, we heard today, it was dangerously misplaced. Helen McNamara was the second most senior official in government. She told how Johnson and his team thought Britain would sail through the impending crisis.
And nothing but the truth. That the sort of unbelievably bullish, we're going to be great at everything approach is not a smart mentality to have inside a government meeting.
COVID had by then ripped through northern Italy, pushing its hospitals to breaking point.
If we could just tell people what the right and kind and proper thing to do is, people would do that. And sitting there and saying it was great and sort of laughing at the Italians was just, it just felt completely, well, it felt how it sounds.
Eventually, she went into the Prime Minister's office and delivered this message, read by the inquiry's lawyer.
I have come through here to the Prime Minister's office to tell you all, I think we're absolutely I think this country is heading for a disaster.
As Britain went into lockdown, she claims the Health Secretary wasn't telling the truth. We heard about a sexist, macho culture in Boris Johnson's government, and this is one of the most senior officials saying it had huge implications. Women, she said, were not listened to or respected, and there was detachment at the top of government from the reality of many people's lives. This is an email Helen McNamara sent in April 2020, telling female colleagues the issues she thinks weren't considered. Abortion, domestic abuse, families, fertility treatment, and the fact PPE did not fit women.
Women whose job it was to do something were not able to do their jobs properly because they weren't having the space or being asked the right questions or being treated with the respect that they would do.
She was fined for attending a gathering at the Cabinet Office during the pandemic and said it shouldn't have happened, but described a culture in which hundreds of ministers and officials broke the rules. By winter, COVID was again soaring. Christmas celebrations cancelled at the very last minute. Helen McNamara left government shortly afterwards. Tamara Cohen, Sky News.
And Tamara joins us from outside the COVID inquiry in central London. Good to see you, Tamara. Now, it was a toxic, macho culture in Downing Street under Boris Johnson. Has it changed since then?
Yes, devastating evidence from Helen McNamara about that toxic, sexist culture. We heard the messages yesterday from Dominic Cummings, and she said that she was disappointed that Boris Johnson didn't tackle that culture, but more importantly, that that culture had big implications, and she thinks lives were lost as a result of not tackling issues, for example, like domestic violence in the first lockdown. She went on to say that despite that, she tried to, in her meetings in government, raise these issues and says that she was brushed aside. Interestingly, I was talking to an ally of Rishi Sunak tonight about that toxic culture Helen McNamara describes, and they were keen to point out that Rishi Sunak has a lot of senior women in jobs in Number 10, his Director of Communications, the head of his policy unit and his principal private secretary, and that the language he saw in Dominic Cummings' messages yesterday, this person told me, simply wouldn't be tolerated in his Downing Street. Now, Boris Johnson and others involved are not commenting at this stage. He will give evidence to the inquiry later this year, and some people I've spoken to say that this culture was not that far-reaching in Downing Street, but certainly it sounds like not only was there groupthink at the top of government with small numbers of people with limited experience making those decisions, but she said that this had huge implications for the run-up to the lockdown policy itself, and how it panned out for the rest of that year and the following year as the lockdowns continued.
OK. Tamara Cohen there, thanks so much. Now, you can tell when the government want to show they're taking a problem seriously, they give the solution a fancy name. And today we had the Bletchley Declaration, a UK brokered deal between 28 countries to collaborate on managing the potential dangers of artificial intelligence. One of the attendees, Tesla owner Elon Musk, told Sky News that the technology does pose a risk. Well, a little earlier, I spoke to Paul Scully, the Minister for Tech and Digital Economy, and asked him about the risks of AI that were acknowledged in today's sign-in of the Bletchley Declaration.
AI means a lot of things. It's not a single bit of technology. So clearly there are massive risks if left unchecked, and that's what this is all about. To understand those risks, to then mitigate those risks, especially at an international stage, that we can then come forward to harness the benefits of AI.
And the Prime Minister's meeting Elon Musk tonight, is that a coup for Rishi Sunak?
No, I think it's really important that the Prime Minister meets with the people at the forefront of actually developing AI and the applications of AI. So speaking to Elon Musk, speaking to all of those industry leaders is really, really important, because that's how we get that collaboration. This has to be co-creation of a solution between not just governments, but businesses and academia, all working together, so we're not just wagging fingers at each other.
And what's your view of X? Is it up to standard? Is it...
Well, I think that, what they've done with community notes is one area about tackling misinformation, disinformation in some of these areas, but they do need to go further, and that's what the online safety bill is pushing them and the other platforms to do. And so I'm saying to, whether it's Elon Musk or other people within X and all those other platforms, don't wait. Don't wait until you have to do it. Start doing it now, because you know what's coming.
Because the Institute for Strategic Dialogue concluded anti-Semitic tweets in English more than doubled after Mr Musk took over X, once called Twitter. A report from the European Commission found that engagement with pro-Kremlin accounts grew 36% on the platform in the first half of this year after Mr Musk lifted mitigation measures.
And that's why I'm saying come in now and do it, because, look, I'm not pretending this is easy to actually remove and detect some of this sort of stuff, but there's plenty more that can be done. And all we're asking for is, if it's illegal, it should not be online. If it's not in their terms, against their terms and conditions, it shouldn't be online. And so those things are things that the companies like X and others, and I'm not singling them out in particular, can actually start to introduce now.
But, Paul, the point I'm making to you is it's getting worse, not better, under Elon Musk. It's getting worse. You're putting through legislation, and the town square, the virtual town square that we all use, is going down the drain. It's getting worse. What do you say to that?
Well, the entire point of the online safety bill is try to arrest that decline, because what happens with algorithms, by their very design, they tend to push people into corners. And when you see what's happening in the Middle East at the moment, it's not just online. You can see it on the streets of London at the moment. I'm also the Minister for London, that actually there is some severe division, and we've got to do everything we can do to put that society back together again, and actually almost we're trying to put the lid back in the bottle in terms of keeping people safe. But that's why I'm saying everybody has to play their part in it, including X.
The European Commissioner in charge of policing online safety wrote to Mr Musk after the Israel-Hamas war broke out, so very recently, saying his platform needed to sort out violent and terrorist content that circulates on the platform. That was, in recent weeks.
Well, likewise, our Secretary of State, Michelle Donnellan, has had all of the platforms, including X, in and say, right, OK, this is what you need to do. What are you doing? Tell us what you are doing. And we want to, see if that is fit for purpose.
Is this really a man that the Prime Minister should be having a cosy fireside chat with?
It's not about fireside chats. It's about bringing people together.
I think they are sort of having a fireside chat, aren't they?
Well,
aren't they doing a little public Q&A, like a little chit-chat together?
I think they're doing a Business Connect event together, but the point is that it allows for conversations to flow. It allows for views to be aired, and I'm sure both people have got robust views. The Prime Minister will make his views known.
So the message to Elon Musk from the Prime Minister will be: clean up your act, clean up X, and get it done quickly. Is that what you want to hear?
It's telling us what you should already started to have been
But I've just said to you, it's getting worse.
It shouldn't be tomorrow.
It's getting worse.
Sorry
to interrupt, Mr. Scully, but the point I'm trying to make to you in this interview is it's been getting worse under Elon Musk, not better. It's been getting worse.
I appreciate
I've given you loads of evidence to that.
No, absolutely. No, I'm not denying that, Beth. What I'm saying is that since the Secretary of State, Michelle Donlan, has spoken to X and those other platforms, the Prime Minister seeing Elon Musk tomorrow gives him a chance to actually say, right, OK, fine, you've seen the Secretary of State. She has asked you to do exactly what you've been suggesting she does. What have you been doing about it? What are you then? What's the next stage as well? It's keeping that pressure on, because the entire point of the legislation is to keep that pressure on, to get illegal stuff off the internet and get them to adhere to their own terms and conditions, frankly.
OK, I just want to ask you one more thing about the COVID inquiry this week. In Boris Johnson's words, number 10 was an orgy of narcissism at a time of national crisis, a toxic culture, a cabinet called F-pigs and morons, a dysfunctional government lacking in preparedness, crucially, in terms of policy. It's been a very unedifying few days for the government, hasn't it?
Yeah, it has been unedifying. I can't give a running commentary until I've seen all the evidence about exactly what conclusions we take out of it. But I know at the time, I remember when I was representing small businesses, hospitality, retail, and those kind of very hard-pressed businesses, how difficult it was to get the right picture and therefore the right solution and the right people to speak to. That there is a sense of inevitability to a point. At that point, in that kind of stage of a pandemic. But nonetheless, we'll see what comes out in the wash when we know all of the evidence.
You wouldn't blame the public watching these hearings, though, if they might think it might be time to give another party a go at government after what they've heard.
Well, I don't think it's about party. I think you've got a Prime Minister that's no longer in place. You've got a lot of people in number 10 that's not in place. I can understand members of the public who lost loved ones, who had to go through really difficult times in isolating, that they would look at this and think, crikey, it's Partygate all again. I think we are looking back with hindsight, at those 2 years. Let's look at it in the round with the evidence. And if there are lessons to be learned, if there are scapegoats there, let's make it at that point rather than the running commentary now.
Paul Scully there. Well, you're watching the Politics Hub. Coming up, we'll get reaction from that interview, or to that interview, from our panel, Poppy Trowbridge and Andrew Fisher.
I'm Martin Brunt, and I'm Sky's crime correspondent. My most memorable story was, and still is, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann.
Please, please do not hurt her. Please give our little girl back.
We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news.
For detectives, the first 48 hours after a murder are crucial in the search for clues. The public expects them to find Jill Dando's killer soon. The British detectives are planning to meet forensic experts, academics, and even witch doctors.
I remember the grimmest case, the Soham murders of schoolgirls Holly and Jessica. I felt I can't undo what's happened, but I can help explain it.
Ian Huntley was arrested and charged within a fortnight of the murders.
I've never murdered anyone, I've never raped anyone. What am I in jail for?
The parole board has to decide if Bronson needs to be kept locked up for the safety of the public. My biggest challenge was to persuade a jailed diamond thief to answer my letters. Martin Brunt, Sky News, at the Old Bailey.
5 of us have made it out of the car.
Welcome to Backstage, the film and TV podcast.
Welcome back to the Politics Hub. Now, before the break, we were hearing from the government's Paul Scully. Let's get some reaction now from our panel. Former Treasury Advisor Poppy Trowbridge and Andrew Fisher, Director of Policy for the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn. Thank you so much, both of you, for coming in. And we've got a lot to talk about. Where do we start? We've got toxic culture in government. We want to talk about AI and, of course, what's going on in Gaza tonight. So should we kick off maybe with you, Poppy, toxic culture? Look, you worked in government. What did you think of today?
It was so familiar in so many ways. The language, the exasperation, the exhaustion, the confusion, it all rang true. Now, my crisis was Brexit, trying to sort out a deal and figure out the sort of first few months of an administration outside the European Union. So it was a different thing. But a lot of it was really familiar, but some of it today really, I can't say anything other than it has left me deflated. And the articulation of the way women were pushed to the side. I didn't experience it as much myself personally in my time. We had a female prime minister, perhaps that helped redress the balance there. But my heart breaks for all those hardworking women who would have genuinely been there, giving it their all. And I am angry about what is obviously the inevitable waste, the waste of human capital, resource, energy, wasted on surviving the toxic culture, but also those perpetrating it. What a waste of energy at a crucial time.
But did you at times feel, when women talking about feeling invisible? Helen McNamara talked about handing around a book by Caroline Criou Perez about called Invisible Women. Did you feel invisible sometimes?
Listen, in the Treasury, and to be very clear, Philip Hammond's top advisors were women, and it was an equal team. Number 10 had female advisors leading the policy unit at the time, and of course, like I say, a female prime minister under Theresa May. Yeah. So technically speaking, I think we had a better situation. But this is about the attitude of the people, not the number and the balance. It's about the excluding people from conversation and from policy advice. And I think it actually goes beyond some of the subjects that were listed there. I think education often falls to women to deal with. And you think of that extended debacle over school lockdowns, and I think we should add that one to that list.
Actually, something I didn't get to in that my introduction, but I read and thought a lot about was Helen McNamara also talked about the fact about education, that lots of people in the civil servants in government didn't send their kids to state schools. So they didn't necessarily understand that either, what was going on. I mean, it's not just about women, is it, Andrew? It's also about having diverse viewpoints,
I think it's about class. This is a bunch of privately educated men, and, who come from a particular class background, and, social care didn't matter to them. We saw that with the evidence both from Helen McNamara today and from Dominic Cummings yesterday. So areas of working class jobs that are predominantly filled by women didn't matter. And that's a combination of class and misogyny, that those things weren't counted. But actually the culture, the way that politics was talked about, just to me didn't... I'm not saying there weren't flashpoints where people swore occasionally. When you work in a high-pressure political environment, they do. But that kind of misogynistic language and that constant abuse is just alien. I don't know what
One thing I have to say about that, and you will know this as a woman who will have inevitably experienced it, is that behaviour feeds itself. It fuels itself. Yeah. So it's very hard to put a stop to it once it gets going.
Right? The culture's set at the top, and I think that's the problem.
Well, it can also come from the side and from the bottom, but once it gets rolling, it's very hard to nip it in the bud and to cut it off. And I think that is, it's demonstrated in the testimony today that once it had set in, it putrefied the entire policy response.
And the thing is, we can focus on the language or the culture, but the point is it was about the decision making that cascaded down. And I mean, I found the past 3 days of the inquiry has been so revelatory, not just in terms of talk of language and culture, but also just substance of what was happening.
There's a perennial problem here, though, when it comes to policy making, which you will know. Good policy making is done in iterations and with feedback from people who are the object or subject of that policy. Now, COVID made it almost impossible for that interaction to take place, but it happens all the time in politics. And if politicians can't learn that lesson from what's being revealed today, then they're never going to learn it.
And talking about policy, let's move on to events in Gaza tonight. Some foreign nationals have been let through the Rafah crossing. A little glimmer of good news, but of course so many people still trapped in Gaza. Andrew, I know that you feel very strongly that Labour's got the wrong policy on this.
Yeah, I think they should be calling for a ceasefire. And look, Labour's in opposition. It can't change the mood of things, and it takes the international community, and I mean that in the broadest sense, coming together to try and resolve this, because this isn't going to be solved by the US saying something or the UK saying something or the EU saying something. It's got to be inclusive, building in regional partners like Egypt, Qatar and others as well. But we have to put a stop to the killing. A humanitarian pause, which I'm sorry, I just think is this sort of Orwellian phrase of, we can have a bit of a pause for some humanitarianism and then back to the bombing. I'm sorry, just isn't good enough. And you can see that today. Although Keir Starmer's speech, I think, showed a change in tone in some areas. It showed a kind of humanity towards Palestinians for the first time, I think, in one of his interviews or speeches. It hasn't changed things because of what happened yesterday with the bombing of the refugee camp. People are horrified by that. And you've seen another 2 frontbench ministers come out today calling for a ceasefire.
Do you think he'll have to change position? John McDonnell said last night he thought he would.
I can't see how it's tenable. If Israel carries on in this manner for another few weeks or months even that they're talking about, I can't see how the public mood, the mood within the Labour Party isn't going to just force him into changing. And I think it's an unsustainable position because ultimately the only way to settle this is political. You need to get a ceasefire. You need to get those talks going. A pause to just bring in some medical supplies and some food is just not enough.
Do you agree with that, Poppy? What do you think?
I think it's very tricky. And I would be surprised, I may be wrong, but I'd be surprised if he actually did have to change his position. I think he will have thought it through and he's probably set himself up to, but this is your area, not mine. The one thing I do want to say about what happened today is that this is what government and the civil service are supposed to be doing. And your colleague Sam Coates talked about these negotiations that were happening, and we've both seen it happen behind the scenes. This is an example, a small one, and it has made a tiny dent in the bigger issue of that 2 sides, the civil service and the public, working together to a positive result. They must continue to build on this because it will restore some faith in the system.
I mean, it was a glimmer of something today. As I understand, I was told earlier that actually it was foreign aid work, all British nationals or aid workers were perhaps in that first tranche. We don't have clarity yet on who is coming out. And I did contact Hamza Yousaf's office to see about his mother-in-law and some of his relatives trapped there, and they, as of earlier, hadn't heard. So it must be such a difficult time for people with relatives trapped in Gaza.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a friend who's an aid worker who works for an aid charity here, and they've got people out who were killed yesterday in the bombing of the refugee camp. Several of their workers who work for Action Aid in the UK died, and it's tragic. And I think there are 200 British nationals or people with dual nationality in Gaza. So we don't know yet how many of those have come out through the Rafah crossing. And obviously, this is a tragic situation here. You had the UNRWA saying 67, I think, now of their personnel have been killed. And it just reflects this kind of indiscriminate bombing that's going on. This is journalists are being killed, aid workers, indiscriminately because it's not targeted.
Although, Keir Starmer would argue that there has to be some targeted degradation of Hamas infrastructure in order to stop further attacks. I mean, that was his argument.
Look, we all want Hamas removed from Gaza. I mean, there are different options of how that might materialise, and that's got to involve negotiations. But that's got to happen. We all agree on that.
I'd like to carry on, but I'm out of time. We haven't even got to AI. I'm sorry about that. Well, you're watching the Politics Hub. Coming up, can Rishi Sunak confound all predictions and win the next general election? And if not, what next for the right in the UK and across the world? We'll hear from former Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison. Welcome back. You're watching the Politics Hub. Well, at the start of the week, we told you about a conference taking place in South London where leading figures from the political right were gathering to discuss the future of the Conservative agenda. Today, the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship heard from the Business and Trade Secretary, Kemi Badenoch. She's been tipped as a potential Tory leader. So we sent Amanda Acas to hear what she had to say to cheer her party up.
Kemi, was this the start of your leadership campaign? Second time lucky?
Arriving in London's Docklands for a conference organised by a new political movement, the Business Secretary certainly had one eye on her own political future. The Alliance for Responsible Citizenship are trying to set out a fresh vision for global conservatism, with delegates from the US and Australia and speeches from a Republican presidential candidate.
Climatism, COVIDism today, but wokeism, racial wokeism.
And the right-wing Canadian psychologist Jordan Peterson.
We could now bring about a hell that would make all those previous hells look like nothing but practice.
Today it was Kemi Badenoch's turn.
Not being distracted by all sorts of silly things like pronouns and what critical race theory is saying and measuring people's skin colour and so on. All of these things are distractions.
Her controversial comments went down well with the audience, including the shadow Australian Defence Minister.
I think she's got a lot of talent. I think she's a clear speaker, a clear thinker, and of course she represents the changing face of Britain.
She has all what it takes to become a Prime Minister. So I'm praying for that she becomes a Prime Minister.
I thought she was very impressive.
Do you think she would be a good leader in future, potentially?
I know you're trying to get me to speculate. I'm not going to speculate. I mean, who knows what's going to happen even in the next 6 months and year. I love Kemi. I think she's brilliant. I've got a huge amount of respect for her.
For Kemi Badenoch to appear here for many sends a strong signal about her future intentions. She's long been a darling of the Tory right, but she's now the bookies' favourite to take over from Rishi Sunak if he ever stands down as party leader.
But at least one delegate here was unsurprisingly unimpressed.
She's been part of it. I mean, this is what gets me down. You know, Tories, we're going to control immigration, we're going to bring back free enterprise. You haven't done it in 13 and a half years.
With the Tories languishing so far behind in the polls, the battle for the future of right-wing politics is already underway. Amanda Acas, Sky News, Greenwich.
Well, one of the prominent political figures attending that summit was the former Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison. I spoke to him earlier and asked him why he wanted to be there.
I thought, you know, when I received the invitation, there was an opportunity to cover a large sort of territory of issues, but do it from a particular perspective, and a perspective I share. And that is that our Western civilization was grounded on a set of values which drew from a Judeo-Christian heritage. And it was important that we sort of rediscover how those can continue to be applied across so many different aspects of life. And frankly, not just in politics. It goes from everything from how we raise our kids to how we live in communities and have functional communities. And of course, there are political issues, but, you know, entrepreneurship, enterprise, all of these things, learning. It's been a very diverse set of topics that the conference has touched on. It's been very rewarding.
You did do a lot of business with Boris Johnson, be it on trade or indeed security issues. Did you think it was a shame when he was forced out of office?
Well, I thought Boris was making an enormous contribution to British life. Boris sort of returned sovereignty to the United Kingdom, at least in my view, and I suspect in the view of many. But I found his instinctive response on global economic issues, global security issues, one that very much lined up with the way I was looking at things. So, you know, we were fellow travellers on quite a bit. We both went through a pandemic, very different experiences for both of us, and tried to support each other during that process. Particularly both him and Sajid Javid were very helpful to Australia at one particular point, and I'll always be grateful for that. But it was a very tight, trusting relationship, which it always should be, and I think always largely has. And as John Howard reminded us today, his relationship with Tony Blair was also a very positive and a very close one.
And Ms Morrison, you talked about something that was an experience for all global leaders, which was handling the pandemic. Now, in Australia, I think it was viewed that you'd done a really good job and you had managed to keep the mortality rate very low. We are having a COVID inquiry in this country right now. I don't know how much you've heard about it or read about it, but what it's exposing is complete dysfunction at the heart of Boris Johnson's government. He himself describing the operation around him as a, quote, orgy of narcissism and saying it had to stop. Were you shocked by some of this?
Well, I haven't been following that closely. What I do know is this, is that managing the response to COVID was uncharted territory for all of us. And I remember those early months in particular very, very well. It was a time of great uncertainty. People were very, very fearful. In the Northern Hemisphere, it hit you first in your winter. It hit us in a summer. And, I think there are differences there. We moved very quickly to close our borders. And I think that was probably one of the most important decisions we made. I mean, we didn't get our response perfect. It was a shared response between our state governments and our federal government. Some of our states took the lockdowns too far, I think. But, we can all look back in hindsight and be, as they say in the United States, Monday morning quarterbacks. But, if people weren't there and having to make the decision, we can all have views about it later. And I think that's what will come out. And that's okay. We're transparent representative democracies, and that's all part of the process.
Labour in the UK are looking at the Australian election and looking at what Albanese did to defeat you. What can they learn? What can Labour here learn from the Australian election?
Well, I hope they don't learn much at all for the sake of my Tory colleagues in the UK. I mean, they ran a very vicious campaign against me over a very long period of time. But look, I'm not here to do retrospectives on elections. I mean, in politics, you win some, you lose some. You don't get bitter about it. You're thankful for the service that you're able to provide your country. I certainly am. I love my country, and I had a great honour to be both a Prime Minister for almost 4 years and served in Cabinet for around 9. So that's a pretty great opportunity. I'm very thankful for it. But, at the end of the day, we've been in government for 3 terms. It's not often that governments get a 4th term in politics, and people make changes.
And final thought, Mr Morrison, if I may. You talk about 3 terms. The Conservative Party have been in for 4 elections now, 4 terms. What advice, let me put it another way, what advice would you give to Rishi Sunak to try and overturn that Labour poll lead here and win a 5th election? Or is he done?
Well, look, I'm not close enough to know the politics here in the UK, but what I do know is you always got to keep looking ahead. You don't win the next election the same way you won the last one. I think that's a pretty obvious thing in politics, and you've got to keep charting out a positive agenda when you're in government. I mean, oppositions basically sit there and hopefully they believe the government will lose the election, and that's often what occurs. So, from the Tories' point of view here in the UK, it really is about repression, renewal, positive agendas, and connecting with what are the biggest issues that people are facing. And I have no doubt here, that's cost of living crisis. I mean, just picking up, talking to people here, issues around housing affordability, those sorts of things, they're very real issues back in Australia as well. And I think the post-COVID economy has got its big challenges, and people have got to make a decision about who's going to be best to manage those challenges.
And I've got
in Australia, I'd just say in Australia, before the last election, the Labor Party made a whole bunch of promises about how energy prices would come down and, real wages would go up, and none of that's happened. People will tell you what they want to tell you, but when they get into government, sometimes those things don't happen. And I think that's what we've seen in Australia. So don't believe the hype is what I'd suggest to the UK public when you hear a lot of bold claims about what Labor might do here. And obviously the government has got to put its case forward about how it can deal with those really, really challenging issues. And they've got a lot of experienced people to do it, I'm sure, including Rishi.
Scott Morrison there. Well, as we were hearing in that interview, the Conservatives have a mountain to climb if they're to avoid defeat at the next general election. But new exclusive polling for the Politics Hub tonight gives a hint that a crucial group of voters might still be up for grabs. Our Sam Coates is here with all the details. Take it away, Sam.
OK, this is the group that matters in the general election. Now, first of all, I want to start with something you might recognise. This is where we are at the moment. You can see a huge lead for the Labour Party, 48%, 24%, ahead of the Tories, so exactly half of where Labour are at the moment. But it's that figure, Beth, I want you to concentrate on it. Because if you remember, in the 2019 general election, the Tories got actually 44%. And one of the questions in British politics at the moment is what's happened to all of that vote? This poll tells you all about it. And here it is. So it's a huge sample size, by the way, so we've gone into quite a lot of detail. 40% of people who voted Tory in 2019 still would vote Conservative. That's less than half. That's quite a big drop-off rate. That's a problem for the Conservatives. But look at this, a really large number of people who intend to vote but just don't know what they're going to do. Could they go back? We don't know, but that's the group that Tory strategists are focusing on. 12%, the third biggest group, are going to reform UK. Now, this is absolutely fascinating. Now, it's not necessarily a big household name. 12% is, but it's above the Labour Party. The Reform Party is to the right of the Conservatives, and as I say, it's higher than Labour. It's basically 1 in 10 voting, or switching all the way to the Labour Party. That is when Tory strategists tell you that there aren't a large number of switchers, this data backs that up. Now, this is the critical column. Don't knows. What could happen to them? So we've drilled into them. Look at this. Actually, undecided people who voted Tory in 2019, pretty much like Rishi Sunak. There's a net positive rating for him. But look at this. Keir Starmer, minus 61%. So this group of voters don't like him. So even though a lot of them are not voting at the moment Tory again, they don't like him. They do like him. They're also really into immigration. That's their top issue, we found out. So could we see, if we go back to this key group, could we see some of these people more likely to go to the Conservatives? Quite possibly on the basis that they like the issues and they like the Tory leader. We're going to have to wait and see. Here's Patrick English from YouGov, who actually did the polling for us. So why does this group matter?
So these are a crucial set of voters heading into the next general election. They're the voters the Conservatives need to keep on their side. They're also the voters that Labour need to win. Now, at the moment, some of them are still voting Conservative. A lot of them simply are not. And they're all over the place in terms of their intention ahead of the next election. And when we really drill down into what type of voters these are, who they are, what they think about issues, there does seem to be some encouraging numbers for the Conservatives. They rate Rishi Sunak higher than they rate Keir Starmer. They rate the Conservative Party higher than they do the Labour Party. They care about the issues that the Conservatives want to talk about, such as immigration, to a much greater extent than those who already make the jump to Labour. And that's why, at the moment, we think only around 1 in 10 of them are telling us that they're seriously considering voting Labour at the next election.
No, you know, Beth, that is the group that Tory strategists are focusing on. That suggests that's why.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you, Sam. That is really interesting. Well, you're watching the Politics Hub coming up. Rishi Sunak thinks he can help avert a crisis from artificial intelligence. We'll look at times politicians failed to get the technology lack of the regular kind of intelligence.
Very significant issue. The World Health Organization published a report in 2015 that showed that 1.1 billion people between the ages of 12 and 35 were at risk of avoidable hearing loss. So it's a very major problem, 10 million of them at risk in the UK. So we were designed, if you like, 5 million years ago to do what we're doing, communicate with each other. And also to keep ourselves safe, so knowing that the saber-toothed tiger was up there rather than down there. Unfortunately, our hearing hasn't evolved for the levels of sound that we now experience routinely in our lives. And there are a number of big issues, so going to live events, whether they're sporting or music, noisy sports, so motorcycling, things like that, but also headphone use is a very serious issue as well. Well, we need to be conscious of the sound exposure that we're getting. So as part of this campaign, which we're launching today, we're lobbying the government to ask them to make sure that headphones provide safeguarding information to the user. So provide them with information that they can then use to protect their own hearing. There are two risks. One is the risk of hearing loss. So I'm actually a sufferer from hearing loss. So my hearing is around 20 years older than I am, typically. And that's from motorcycling. I used to shoot clay pigeons and obviously, well, not obviously, but I used to go to a lot of live events. And my hearing is damaged. So I have tinnitus. That's very unpleasant. And that is a constant sound in your ears, very, very distracting. The other problems are then functioning in social situations. So if you're in a pub or a cafe or somewhere like that, you can't hear the correspondent that you're talking to. But in addition, there's a risk now that's been identified of hearing loss and cognitive decline being correlated. So if you have hearing loss, you're much more likely to suffer from cognitive decline issues, so Alzheimer's and things of that nature.
And how do you check your hearing?
Go and have a hearing test. The problem is, though, that the hearing tests generally won't highlight that you've got a hearing problem until you've damaged a significant amount of your hearing already. The better thing to do is to look at things like the applications that are running on your phone. So, for example, Apple have on their phones, in the hearing health kit, they have a data bank which shows you what your exposure levels are. Please have a look at it. I think you might be unpleasantly surprised about your exposure levels.
Welcome back to the Politics Hub. Now let's return to the AI summit at Bletchley Park today. Our science and technology editor, Tom Clark, was there and sent this report.
It's certainly a symbolic venue. Bletchley Park, home to the wartime code breakers who pioneered the field of machine learning, in a way the birthplace of modern AI. We overheard Elon Musk going one further.
AI is, in a way, like our descendants, our sort of child or something like that,
The AI he and others are here to discuss is our wayward offspring that must be brought into line.
Elon, I'm from Sky News. Do you think AI is a threat to humanity still?
It's a risk.
While he brought some stardust to the summit, a more quietly significant presence was the Chinese government. This is the first time they've sat round a table to talk AI safety with their American and European counterparts.
Having more than 20 countries coming together, I would hope that maybe next year we're having 40, then we're having 100. I'm really grateful that China and Chinese researchers like myself has been invited. I hope that we have already been providing a complementary view.
The Bletchley Declaration announced today agreed 28 countries here would collaborate on AI safety. They've also agreed to meet again next year. The start of a process to try and control powerful AI. But will the tech companies play ball?
I think we embrace that. I mean, there has to be outside audit and verification of the kinds of capabilities we're developing. I mean, we build some of the largest and most capable language models in the world, and we recognize that doing red teaming ourselves is just the first step. And what we're now setting up as an industry consortium and among many of the other countries is to have more outside visibility on how that process of stress testing them works to make sure that the people in general, the public in general, have confidence that they're going to behave safely.
In closed sessions, delegates heard how AIs off the leash could assist cyber attacks, even help make bioweapons. The main focus of the delegates here at Bletchley Park is on the dangers posed by very large, super intelligent AIs that are expected to be released in the coming few months or years. But what about the AIs that we've already got? There are those at the summit who think the conversation has not been focused enough on the risks already posed by them. Do you think that AIs already run call centres, diagnose illness and feed us ads?
It does some very useful things. Facial recognition, for example, could be useful, can be also really misused for surveillance or policing. So what we're really trying to say is let's steer this technology to work for people in society.
Bletchley's history hasn't been rewritten yet. Nothing substantive has been agreed so far on making AI safer. The delegates have their work cut out, with the ghosts of code breakers watching over their shoulders. Tom Clark, Sky News, Bletchley Park.